You will improve wages and standards of living. You will restart productive investment. You will restore corporate profits of industrial capital. You will get to full employment. We haven't seen full employment in this country since 1945, so that would be quite a change. And you will have increased levels of capital investment per job, which is the key for getting actual profits out of this. My estimate is that you'd be back into a budget surplus within 5 years, and you'd have a trade surplus within 5 years or less. One of the most cynical and criminal things that the Obama regime has done has been to drive the Detroit automakers into bankruptcy. This was useless and needless. These companies should have been nationalized. They should have been shorn of all their derivatives at General Motors Acceptance Corporation and Chrysler Finance and so forth. And they should then have been operated for the public good under emergency conditions. Instead, what Obama did was to drive them into bankruptcy and dish them up to asset strippers, hedge fund hyenas, and others in the form of Ron Bloom, the Maoist sympathizer, and Steve Ratner, a former correspondent of the New York Times and a former hedge fund operator and accused of criminality in that. So Ratner the Rat and Bloom destroyed the U.S. automobile industry. They forced the closure of several thousand local dealers, destroying hundreds of thousands of jobs and destroying productive activity, because an auto repair shop is production. They shut those down. They closed 40 to 50 auto plants, and hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Now, the Michigan unemployment rate is officially about 15% as of the autumn of 2009. That means in reality it's 25% plus. That's getting close to the point at which human society and human civilization unravel. It means you don't have enough tax revenues for police, fire, health, education, and other basic services. In other words, it's a descent into barbarism. Same story in California. California needed $20 to $30 billion to plug a hole in their budget deficit. Obama giving Wall Street $24 trillion, including about $1 trillion direct from the Treasury. But of course, no. He had to refuse any aid to California to prevent the collapse of civilization and the descent into barbarism there. California now leads the nation in Obamavilles, what used to be called a Hooverville, a shanty town for unemployed, homeless people, is now an Obamaville. We know that Tiny Tim Geithner, the tax-chiseling Secretary of the Treasury, has a private cell phone where he's got a speed-dialing arrangement for 3 zombie bankers. One is Pandit the Bandit at Citibank, the second is Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs, and the third, Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase. Now, that is, in effect, the fascist corporate state in action. Banking is now a state-sponsored compulsory cartel. You want to be in it, you have to join the cartel. You have to accept the conditions laid down by people like Summers and Geithner and Volcker and the rest of them. And every day, Geithner gets his marching orders from the participants in the cartel, from Blankfein, from Pandit, and from Jamie Dimon. So this is a regime where the Secretary of the Treasury is told what to do by 3 zombie bankers who would have been gone. They would have been probably in jail, but certainly in bankruptcy, if they had not been bailed out with tens and tens of billions of dollars of public money. So that's the fascist corporate state. That is what Obama represents. The main point about Detroit is you look at those factories, right? You can still see Henry Ford's River Rouge plant. You can see the various plants of the big 3 automakers which have absorbed other companies over the years. Those factories could lift the world, and now they're closing down. Why should we have an empty auto plant and unemployed auto workers when people around the world and in this country need the products that could come out of those factories? Why don't we nationalize the Federal Reserve and get those auto workers back to work reconverting auto plants to build things like tractors for African farmers? We could build high-speed rail, maglev rail, for urban mass transit and passenger rail, freight rail here in the United States. You could build aerospace equipment. You could build nuclear reactors. You could build modular housing. You could build modular components for factory buildings, modular hospitals that you could plunk down in rural Russia and rural China. The only missing ingredient is credit. You go to Bernanke and say, Ben, I need a loan from the Federal Reserve to reconvert the Detroit automakers. And Ben says no. He says, we have 0% credit, but only if you're a bank. Not if you want to produce, only if you're a parasite, only if you want insurance, derivatives, credit cards, and the rest of it. But if you want to actually create a tangible physical product, a manufactured commodity, we have no time for you. You look at the history of the automobile industry. They were producing autos into 1941. When Roosevelt's Lend-Lease began to kick in, it began to convert from manufacturing cars for a still somewhat depressed domestic market to manufacturing war material, defense goods, first for the British until the middle of 1941, and then also for the Soviets after the middle of 1941. So you can go from building cars in 1940-41 to building B-17s and B-29s. Now that essentially means you can reconvert those factories to do literally anything. The only missing ingredient is credit and political will. And you better get those tool and die people, those productive auto workers, back in before they get too old, because you got to train a new generation. Once those abilities are lost, they're lost. So use them or lose them. After 1945, the UAW with Walter Reuther proposed a series of reconversions to convert out of war production into other things, to promote locomotives, mass transit, and to promote other kinds of diversified production from Detroit. The very narrow-minded management of the Detroit automobile industry rejected those things. And then we get into the area of really incompetent managers like Roger Smith and so forth. Just remember, though, that the really incompetent people in Detroit are all tools of Wall Street. They're all people who have been imposed by the Wall Street financiers who own the stocks of these companies. So the great task today is to realize that if you don't have industrial production, you're going to become ethnographic material. If you don't have factories that produce capital goods and high value added, high capital intensity products that you can export, you're going to become the object of study for Chinese anthropologists who are going to come over and look at this strange civilization where people think that derivatives have value and hedge funds have value, but Detroit auto plants and other kinds of productive plant and equipment have no value. So you can either learn Chinese so that you can talk to the anthropologists who are going to come and study this queer, exotic form of life that we have here in North America, or you can gear up production and get back to the path of measures that have worked well in the past and will work even better in the future. The basic rule of politics is that if you're not fighting bankers and financiers, you're spinning your wheels. You're being used by somebody. You're being duped. You may be cutting your own throat. So just remember, Wall Street is the enemy. Wall Street has always been the enemy. Breaking the power of Wall Street, cutting them down to size, reducing this dictatorial hold of Wall Street over the federal government, that's the project. Government in itself is a battlefield. It's where the population confronts, or should confront, inordinate Wall Street power. The substance of politics is a fight against finance capital. For Republicans, there's something that you can do too. The Republican Party had positive features when it considered itself the party of heavy industry. Modern industrial production found its expression in the Republican Party. If we had a Republican Party today that came on the scene as the party of heavy industry, we would be much better off. Instead, the Republican Party, and this is one of the reasons why it's so grotesquely distorted, the Republican Party comes on the scene as a party of sweatshops, of low-wage, union-busting employers, largely concentrated in the southern states, with the main idea of driving down wages, driving down benefits. Cheap labor means low profits. The success of the United States was as a high-wage economy. You try to turn the U.S. into a low-wage economy, that's a recipe for ruin. We need to have a high-wage economy, and the Republican Party should learn from even somebody like Henry Ford, who knew that if you don't pay the automobile workers a living wage, they can't buy your products. It's just that simple. So instead of being the party of low-wage sweatshops across the country, the Republican Party ought to reform themselves and fight for what we have to call industrial capital. Industrial capitalism works. That's what the U.S. has functioned on, and that's what has gotten us successes. Finance capital does not work. And what we have today is a situation where the finance capitalists run the government, they own Obama, they dictate the policies, and finance capital is in the process of crushing industrial capital, see the demise of the auto industry, and also crushing commercial capital. We have CIT. This is a bank which provides credit so you can get goods from factories into retail stores in time for the holidays every year. And this is about to go bankrupt. And Geithner and Bernanke are watching CIT go bankrupt and saying, we don't care about that, that's not systemic. Well, that's just several 100,000 jobs. We have an economy in the United States today which is 2/3 consumer spending. Now, that's way too much. We ought to rebuild our economy so we had much more of it in the area of capital goods and industrial production. But once you're in a situation where 2/3 of your economy is retail sales and consumer spending, you damn well better keep that going, because if you let that crash, then you've got nothing left to keep people going and keep people eating. So we're in the middle of a general shipwreck, a general breakdown crisis, a decomposition and collapse of the entire world economy, and we need these measures. It's a disintegration of the banking system, a disintegration of the U.S. dollar. What we have today in the United States, even before a crisis of economy and finance, is a crisis of the entire ruling class. We have a ruling elite of bankers, politicians, and other masters of human destiny who are insane and incompetent. It's the kind of ruling class that destroys countries and civilizations. Look at a guy like Larry Summers. He believes that derivatives represent value. We've now got $1.5 quadrillion worth of derivatives crushing the world economy, causing the depression, because this is the main cause of what's going on right now. Larry Summers does not want to interfere with that. Back in the 1990s, there was a battle inside the Clinton administration between Brooksley Born of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission on the one hand, who wanted to not even regulate derivatives. She just wanted to make derivatives reportable, to know how many derivatives there were, over-the-counter derivatives, futures, options, indices, but above all, the over-the-counter derivatives, which are the structured investment vehicles, the credit default swaps, the collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, and so forth. She simply said, let's make them reportable. And a howl went up. No, that's communism, said Greenspan, said Phil Graham of Texas, said Wendy Graham, his charming wife, said Bob Rubin from Citibank, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for Clinton, and Larry Summers, who was also in the Clinton Treasury. So Summers believes in derivatives. He's part of the gang that brought you derivatives. Deregulated derivatives have destroyed the world economy more than any other single financial factor. When he became president of Harvard, Larry Summers said, let's put the whole Harvard endowment into derivatives. I think at that point they had $40 or $45 billion. And he actually believed it. He believed that this was an investment. So the result is, of course, that after the crash, the Harvard endowment has lost 1/3 of its value on derivatives.